Hi, everyone. This is Natalie Newman. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We will start the webinar in a few minutes. We'll just give people a little bit of time to log on. But thank you so much for being here. Okay, I'm going to give attendees just one more minute and then we will get started. All right, I am going to get started. So hello all and welcome to Decriminalize, Destigmatize, and Legitimize Substance Use and Pregnancy. I hope you can hear me okay. If you can't, please just drop a question or comment. But this webinar will cover what you need to know about substance and pregnancy, including history, myths and facts, and what happens when mixing in a policy, and how to use a harm reduction and reproductive justice framework to move towards a more equitable and compassionate future. Again, thank you all so much for joining us here today. As we get into the webinar, you can feel free to drop questions in the question box. We will have a Q&A session at the end to answer your questions, but feel free to drop those questions in at any time. And let's get started. Oh, geez. Okay, great. So your host, the person talking right now, is Natalie Newman, and I am the Wisconsin organizer for Reproaction. I'm based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I use she, her pronouns. And our co-presenter is Joelle Puccio. They are a traveling registered nurse and the director of education for the Academy of Perinatal Harm Reduction. They use she, her, or they, them pronouns, and they are based all over. They also do work on direct service syringe access. So I will go over the agenda briefly before we dive right in. So first we'll have a brief overview of concepts, then we'll move into grounding. Following that, we'll go into a broad overview of the racialized history of drug prohibition in the United States and how myths impacted public perception of drug use and drug policy. Joelle will then cover and destigmatize pregnancy and substance use and go over what we know and what we don't, i.e. what evidence we do have and what evidence we don't, which should be fantastic. And then I will talk about how specific myths about substance use and pregnancy turned into policy with Wisconsin's Unborn Child Protection Act, also known as Act 92, as a case study. Then I'll finish off with talking about how pregnancy is criminalized throughout the United States, including abortion criminalization and fetal personhood laws. Then we'll go to a Q&A and close. And I know this one's a lot of ground to cover, so sit tight and thank you so much. So Reproaction leads bold direct action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are proud of our left flank analysis and our willingness to hold everyone accountable, whether they identify as allies or opposition. We are pro-abortion and proud. We are committed to nonviolent direct action, and we are a national, all-virtual organization. And I will introduce the Academy of Perinatal Harm Reduction. So the Academy of Perinatal Harm Reduction seeks to improve the lives of pregnant and parenting people who use substances. They envision a community where all families are safe, intact, and informed, regardless of what they put in their bodies. They are committed to addressing perinatal substance use with a reproductive equity and social justice lens. So I think it's important to start off this section by noting that reproductive health, reproductive rights, and reproductive justice are all different things, and I will be covering reproductive justice. The term reproductive justice was originally coined by members of what would become Sister Song, a Black-led reproductive right justice organization founded in 1997. It is defined as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. The term, again, was invented by Black women in 1994, and this group of Black women came together because they knew that the mainstream women's rights movement, led by mostly upper middle class white women, could not defend the rights of Black women or other marginalized women or trans women. And as such, the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice was founded. According to Sister Song, reproductive justice is an internationally recognized human right about access, not choice. And according to Sister Song's webpage outlining reproductive justice, mainstream movements have focused on keeping abortion legal as an individual choice. While that is necessary, it is not enough. Abortion access is critical. Women of color and marginalized women often have the most difficulty accessing reproductive health care, including access to contraception, abortion access, STI prevention, prenatal care, and the list goes on. And as said best by Sister Song, there is no choice where there is no access. Again, I want to underscore that reproductive justice is not just about abortion. It goes beyond abortion. Access to abortion is critical, but it is not enough. And reproductive justice as a concept combines both reproductive rights and social justice elements, and we have Black women to thank for the creation of this term. I'm going to hand it over to Joelle quickly to explain what harm reduction is in regards to perinatal harm reduction, and I will be silent for a second, so take it away, Joelle.
All right, sorry, unmute before you start talking. So harm reduction, it can be understood in both a very simple and basic kind of way, and it's also, like most things, much more complex than necessarily meets the eye. So the basic idea of harm reduction is reducing harms and also risks of harms. Most definitions of it, especially one from the Harm Reduction Coalition that can be found at harmreduction.org, focus on kind of a two-pronged harm reduction approach. First, it is about practical strategies and interventions to reduce the harms associated with substance use. And secondly, it's a movement for respect, dignity, and empowerment for people who use substances. There's a lot of back and forth in the harm reduction community about these definitions. And one thing that I've been thinking about a lot over the past year or so is that in my work, I'm not really ever focusing very much time or effort on reducing harms that the root of the harm is a substance or a pharmacological effect. Most of the time, what I'm pushing back against is harms caused by the drug war and our systems and our responses to substance use. So if we look at, for example, the overdose crisis, certainly the way substances work in our bodies is part of that. But we also know that these very same substances can be used safely and are used safely in many other contexts around the world and within the United States. It's not the drugs that are the problem necessarily, or the main problem. Most of the harms that we associate with substance use are related to the context that we put folks in. So the reason the overdose crisis is so terrible in the United States right now is because our folks who use drugs are pushed towards less safe methods of administration. They're pushed towards hiding their use, using alone. You cannot give yourself naloxone after you have overdosed. And so that isolation and that shame directly contributes to our death rate. So this graph over here talks about harm reduction kind of in more lofty, kind of big picture ideas. Harm reduction is about safety, like I was talking about, access to overdose prevention, clean and sterile supplies. It's about autonomy. It's about being able to seek help from healthcare or social services and to drive what the goals are rather than being told as a client what your goals are or should be, or which goals the service provider is willing to help you with and which goals they're going to leave you high and dry for. And that's a big piece of shared decision making and informed consent. My job as a nurse and a healthcare provider is to provide information and support whatever decision the client makes. And sometimes that's tough. Not so much for me in harm reduction situations anymore, because I've kind of reordered the way my brain works for that. But like the other day, I was talking with a NICU mom about a surgery that the doctors were recommending for her baby, which I didn't tell her this, but I very strongly did not think that it was necessary. But I don't know everything, and it's not my baby, and it's her baby, and it's her life. And my job is to provide information and support what she decides. And so she decided that she did want this surgery. And so I moved it forward and supported it and tried to do everything in my power to get her this thing that I personally didn't really want her to have. And it's that kind of an attitude that we need to transfer to people who use drugs as well. It's not my job to decide what's best for my patients. It's my job to support what they tell me is best for them. Sorry, I went on a long time, Natalie. Go ahead.
No, that's totally okay. Thank you so much for that. And I expect we'll have more of that great content as we go on. But I'll move into our next segment so we can get to yours, Joelle. So, oh, geez. Okay. So thank you again for that overview, Joelle. So the question you may be asking right now, or you may be considering, is, are harm reduction and reproductive justice related? And the answer is, of course they are, but how? So both advocate for and work towards changes within established institutions. Both work against stigma in various forms, and more specifically, both terms address stigma around reproductive health care and rights and stigma around drug use. Both concepts and practices have also been around for ages, and the stigmatization of both have been around for ages. It's important to note that these concepts and practices did not evolve out of professional, i.e. white, medical communities. And it's important to remember that these concepts came from communities caring for themselves. We also want to take a moment to acknowledge the work of our elders. These movements are in danger of being taken over by the establishment, and we need to recognize and reflect on the work that brought us here. It is crucial to keeping the origins and the history of either movement, reproductive justice, or harm reduction alive. And going back into how they're both similar, both advocate for decriminalization of basic intrinsic human behaviors like drug use, sexual activity, and freedom, etc. And both focus on equal access to care across the board in a broad sense. In sum, drug use and pregnancy meet at the intersection of substance use criminalization and pregnancy criminalization, and together they have definitive ties to abortion access. Further, the issue of drug use and pregnancy meet at the intersection of harm reduction and reproductive justice. Both working concepts can be used together to create a more compassionate and equitable future. Additionally, by joining these concepts together, we're able to use those guiding beliefs and values to address issues in our society. Okay, so I will now go into the prohibition of drugs in the United States, and this is a bit of a trigger warning because there may be some upsetting features of the images I'm about to show you. Okay, so this first image on the bottom left is a red image from Equity.org. You can even see their ad name down here. And Equity.org is an organization working to dismantle the United States' unjust, inequitable, and ineffective drug policies. The image text states 30 nights in Chinatown, horrors of the Mongolian settlement, San Francisco, California. And the image is of a hand holding a rope connected to a person hanging. And I will get into exactly why these images are important in a second. The second image, it says marijuana, weed with roots in hell. And I'm not going to read all of the text there, but you can kind of see for yourself. The overarching themes in this picture, as you can see, are like violence and danger, and the, quote, others are coming for your white women with a despondent white woman in, undergarments featured looking dazed. And you can kind of see exactly what they want you to think about marijuana when you look at this, with weird orgies and wild parties and all of that good stuff. So you can kind of see already where this is going. And then the third image, it's a headline from the early 1900s with the phrase, "Blank cocaine fiends are a new Southern menace," referring to Black men. Indeed, many of the United States' current illegal, quote, illicit drugs have been used for spiritual and medicinal purposes prior to their criminalization, including marijuana, opium, and psychedelics. Prior to their prohibition, they were used medicinally and recreationally. For example, Sears sold syringes of cocaine in the 1890s before it was prohibited. And the overarching themes that I'll get into in a second is, one, that we know drug policy is inherently racist. 2, the repercussions of criminalizing drugs and drug policy has fueled mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex. So I'll give you a little breakdown in chronological order of drug prohibition and racism. So to start off, we'll start in the 1870s. Anti-opium laws started to pop up in the United States during this time, and the creation of these laws were directed at fear of Chinese immigrants and immigration. Opium smoking was associated heavily with the Chinese and Chinese immigration at the time, and an influx of Chinese immigrants prompted the creation of racist anti-opium laws targeting this population. Generally speaking, the United States then placed the blame on the rise of opium use on the Chinese immigrant population, though there were, of course, other ways that opium was not regulated and was sold throughout the United States. Moving into the 1900s, anti-cocaine laws popped up that were directed at Black men in the South. It was believed that cocaine use allegedly transformed Black men into, quote, murderous people, generating more fear amongst white people. The suspicion of cocaine use was even used to justify lynching, and I want to underscore the word suspicion. Popular media and medicine at the time justified the, quote, cocaine fiend, which led to legislation. For example, at congressional hearings, physicians testified that, quote, most of the attacks upon white women of the South are the direct result of a cocaine-crazed blank brain, a claim that had no proof. This and a general fear and hatred of Black people allowed for legislation to come to fruition and pass. And this is just another example of the government trying to control marginalized populations, but I will get into that more as I go on. In the 1910s and 1920s, anti-marijuana legislation popped up in the Midwest and the South directed at Mexican immigrants. Even though marijuana use was considered rare in Mexican communities at the time, it was still associated with this community, and that is primarily due to the work of 2 legal scholars in the 1900s that are responsible for this unfounded association. They first argued that marijuana legislation followed the spread of Mexican immigrants, supposedly directly correlated to the spread of marijuana throughout the United States, with little evidence to back up their claims. And these claims that they made only had fragments of evidence to back them up, but the anti-Mexican sentiment and fear spread, and the creation of anti-marijuana laws started to pop up in various states as, quote, anticipatory legislation in regards to immigration and drug prohibition. Okay, moving on. And again, many of the current illegal drugs that are illegal now have been used for spiritual and medicinal purposes prior to their criminalization. Here are some timestamps again to see how we got where we are today. So moving forward into the 1920s specifically, we'll start with 1919, which marked the passage of the 18th Amendment. This prohibited the sale, distribution of, and production of intoxicating liquors. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was passed in response to some states' prior marijuana prohibition policy, and it prohibited the importation, cultivation, possession, and or distribution of marijuana. We're going to do a big jump right to the 1970s because this is when the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act was passed. This prohibited the use of, quote, controlled substances, meaning that this regulated the manufacture and distribution of narcotics, stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, anabolic steroids, and chemicals used in the illicit production of controlled substances. The Controlled Substances Act was passed in the mid-70s, and this served as a legal foundation of the United States government's fight against drugs. The war on drugs, quote, officially began in June of 1971 when U.S. President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse to be, quote, public enemy number 1. We now know that the drug war was a dangerous, years-long failed attempt to address public policy and safety by using punitive measures to address societal issues. We're going to jump up to when Ronald Reagan entered office because he doubled down on Nixon's drug war and expanded the reach of the drug war. This expansion, again, focused on criminal punishment rather than treatment. And this led to a massive increase in incarcerations for nonviolent drug offenses, from 50,000 in 1980 to 400,000 in 1997. Public concern about illicit drug use skyrocketed during this time, and this is when popular media honed in on crack cocaine use. Portrayals of mainly Black cocaine users were pushed by media, and the response was mass panic and confirmation of racist stereotypes for white people. In 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was passed, and this singled out crack offenders with the most severe punishment. Under the law, possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine incurred the same 5-year minimum sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine, which is a very big difference in quantity. You can see this in the little graphic on the bottom right. There was a definitive racial gap in drug policy enforcement due to discriminatory policing on marginalized communities, law enforcement disproportionately focusing on urban areas, low-income communities, and communities of color in policing, leading to higher arrest and incarceration rates for people of color, particularly Black people. I'm going to give you just a few stats at the beginning quote of Reagan's drug war, just to demonstrate how Reagan's hand was how he had a very big hand in the expansion of the United States prison system and the criminal justice system. In every year from 1980 to 2007, Black people were arrested nationwide on drug charges at rates relative to population that were 2.8 to 5.5 times higher than white arrest rates. Black people are punished more severely than whites for drug crimes, even though drug use between 2 racial groups is roughly the same. Though Black and white people use drugs at generally the same rates, Black people are far more likely to be criminalized for their drug use. And according to an article written in 2019, Hispanics have also been prosecuted on federal crack charges at a higher rate than whites, though the disparity is not as great between white people and Black people. However, it is listed here that the FBI does not track arrests by ethnic group. We'll spend some more time talking about the implications of crack cocaine on the next slide, but as far as statistics demonstrate the rapid spread of cocaine, from 1980 to 2014, the rate of drug arrests for accused Black cocaine and narcotics offenders was at least twice the rate of whites, and it was often much higher than that. Most crack users were and still are white, according to federal surveys. Yet, Black people were sent to federal prison nearly 7 times more often for crack offenses from 1991 to 2016. Okay, so going forward, we will spend time on the crack epidemic specifically and the crack baby myth. So the crack epidemic ravaged Black communities in the 80s and bore the brunt of popular media attention and portrayal of Black and brown drug users. This led to the destruction of Black family in popular media and in real time. The spread of crack cocaine throughout inner city Black communities led to the idea of the quote crack mother or the quote crack baby myth. But where exactly did that come from? In the early 1980s, Dr. Ira Chasnoff of Northwestern University began to study the effects of pregnancy and crack cocaine use. This study was conducted on 23 mothers who used crack cocaine during pregnancy, and his initial findings were quickly picked up and transformed by widespread panic and unrelenting popular media attention. His original findings that children born to mothers who used crack cocaine while pregnant were born, quote, sicker, smaller, and less social than the other babies. This idea resonated with long-held racist views of Black Americans, and popular media took this and ran with the crack-addicted baby. Soon after, hundreds of stories and articles about the new phenomenon started to flood the United States. Media further pushed the idea that Black mothers who used crack while pregnant would give birth to a generation of permanently damaged children, costing the US government potentially millions of dollars, and thereby causing a whole generation of children to be left behind. However, experts in the field were able to debunk Chasnoff's claims over and over, and this is a recurring theme that we will see. Yet the narrative still persists. By the end of the 80s, this flawed and inconclusive study was being used to criminally charge pregnant women who use crack. But what exactly is the crack baby? The crack baby is the idea that babies who were exposed to crack cocaine in utero were being born, quote, addicted, and the effects of crack cocaine exposure resulted in a generation of permanently damaged children. This ideology stemmed from the war on drugs after this idea of a, quote, drug-addicted baby was thoroughly discredited. Although the crack baby was eventually, again, recognized as a myth, it was too late and the narrative still persists today. The myth of the crack baby can be attributed to racism and moral panic around Black motherhood. Reports began to surface of children born to Black mothers who used crack that were neurologically damaged and somehow less than human. Further, Black mothers that used crack were seen as irretrievably depraved and ultimately indifferent to their children. This idea was only confirmed with stereotypes and racist attitudes white people already had about Black motherhood. And the narrative that addicted mothers were so callous and uncaring for the health of their pregnancies and newborn came directly from the creation of the crack baby and the crack mother myth. Researchers again debunked the damage generation theory numerous times, finding no indication that children exposed to crack in the womb faced long-term debilitation and that the effects were indistinguishable from effects associated with poverty, including homelessness, domestic violence, and malnutrition. Despite the claims being debunked numerous times, again, by experts in the field, the racistness of the crack baby had already taken flight and it still persists today. The pervasive narrative of the crack baby just shows how junk science and racist attitudes about Black people, specifically Black motherhood, can work together to shape dangerous policy, which will lead to the creation of the Unborn Child Protection Act, which we will get into later on in this webinar. We also know that Black babies are tested at far higher rates than white babies. Hospitals have guidelines, or some hospitals have guidelines for screening infants and need to have a certain number of criteria met in order to screen an infant for drugs. But in one study, it was found that newborns born to African-American mothers were 35% more likely to be tested, with just 13% of white newborns being tested. I will talk about this a little bit more as we get into Act 92. But additionally, the crack baby epidemic had implications far beyond the 80s and would lead to the expansion of the already broken child welfare and foster care system. For example, in just 5 years, from 1985 to 1990, the rate of children being placed in out-of-home care increased by 45%. In 1985, roughly 275,000 youth were in foster care. By 1998, the number increased to nearly 565,000 youth in foster care, and the number of families ripped apart by this were disproportionately Black. Though we won't be able to cover that specifically in this webinar, it's important to note as we go forward. And now that we've talked about reproductive justice, drug prohibition, and the crack baby myth, I will hand it over to Joelle to talk about substance use and pregnancy, what we know and what we don't know, and I will hand it over to them right now. Thanks, Joelle.
Perfect. Thank you, Natalie. That was so good. I'm particularly impressed that you were able to do such a thorough job so quickly. So before we get into the evidence, I want to talk a little bit about how knowledge around substance use and pregnancy is produced. Firstly, as Natalie mentioned a whole bunch earlier on, a lot of what we know and think we know about substance use in pregnancy, even for doctors and nurses and other types of clinicians, it comes from the popular media and the movies and the articles and the stuff that we're just saturated in daily. And a lot of the official knowledge production, like in the scientific literature, is driven by money, and it's driven by systems that we have built in our inherently racist and white supremacist society. And so what we end up with is a certain kind of truth making it through and a lot of other truths being filtered out. So for example, roughly 90% of the substance use research that is funded in the United States is funded by NIDA, or the National Institutes of Drug Abuse. And they are notorious for only funding studies that are explicitly looking for negative outcomes associated with substance use. And that research is super important and we should totally have it. But we also need to be able to fund research about what people are getting out of substance use, right? Because we know that people don't do things that are counterproductive, at least, from the beginning. Substance use begins for most people because it is filling a need that they have in one way or another. Of course, we can talk more about as it goes down the line whether that becomes counterproductive or stays productive. But that's why people use substances, because they work. I like to socially lubricate a little bit with a drink or two in certain social situations because I get nervous talking to strangers. And perhaps there's, a single mom out there working 2 jobs and trying to raise toddlers, and she needs to be able to work 20 hours a day during the week because there's no help and she's got to get stuff done. And so there are reasons that people use substances. And without looking at all aspects and the entire context of substance use, we can't really address it in the research. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about on these next slides is what we know and what we don't know, and what we really should be focusing our research on, because there are certain items that we've just beaten to death. Like, we know enough about, you know, I can't think of an example right now, but we know enough about a bunch of these things. There are hundreds and sometimes thousands of papers, but that information isn't really useful from a clinical perspective. So we'll get into the rest of it. You can go to the next slide, Natalie. I also want to make a distinction that when I'm talking about substance use, problematic substance use, or substance use disorder, those are three different things. Most substance use is not problematic. About 80 to 90% of people who have ever used a substance did so without significant issues, and most folks are able to stop using substances without any kind of intervention. Problematic substance use and substance use disorder are kind of more similar. Problematic substance use, the way I'm going to talk about it, is defined by the person as a problem that they want addressed. And then substance use disorder is, of course, defined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th version, which came out in 2013, which identifies 11 diagnostic criteria for 10 classes of substances. So we're just going to talk about the 6 most frequently used recreational substances that we see in pregnant populations. So first up, alphabetically, we have alcohol. And we know that there are direct and measurable effects of alcohol use during pregnancy, particularly fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, formerly known as fetal alcohol syndrome. We know that the prevalence in the United States for infants born affected by alcohol exposure is about 2 to 5%, which is between 1 in 20 and 1 in 50 births. So this is just a massive effect that we're seeing from alcohol use. A lot of times when I bring this up, people say, oh, well, you know, my cousin in France or my friend who's a midwife in Ireland or whatever says that it's very socially normalized to drink alcohol over there during pregnancy. And I would also like to point out, yes, that is accurate. And when you look at European rates for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, they're 2 or 3 times what we have in the United States. So most of these effects, like effects of most substances, are really subtle and mild. Not the type of thing that you can tell immediately upon meeting somebody or looking at them or, you know, clinically assessing. So most of the affected children are on the milder side, but we do see long-term and permanent effects such as physical and developmental issues. There are specific facial features that we see in these kids. Usually they fade by adolescence or the teen years, and you can't identify that anymore. The features are kind of eyes close together, flat nasal bridge. So the part of your nose between your eyes is kind of flatter. And then that little wrinkle under your nose to your lip, the nasal philtrum, is also kind of smooth and not as wrinkly as it is for other kids. And like I said, all that fades by adolescence. But I think it's really important when we're talking about substances, so often we focus just on the physical stuff, but having a face that identifies you as somebody who is exposed to alcohol in utero is hard for people and affects their mental and physical health and their development as they grow up. So I think it's really important that we keep that in mind, that the people that we're talking about, both the pregnant people and their children, they're more than just a body. It's really important to think about their experience of pain, both physical and emotional, and their mental health as we go through this. Some other more short-term effects that we see with alcohol are miscarriage and stillbirth rates are slightly increased with alcohol use, and we see impaired placenta function. So I know there's a wide variety of professions on the call. I'm just going to explain some of the medical stuff in case there are folks that are unfamiliar. So the placenta is the organ that grows with the baby inside the uterus, and that acts as kind of a go-between for the pregnant person and the baby. So nutrients pass through to the baby, and then, waste products pass through in the other direction. So with alcohol, we see impaired function, which can result in things like smaller babies or nutritional defects. You can go to the next slide, please, Natalie. So what we don't know about alcohol exposure, and what I'm really interested in, is why do we not see dose-dependent outcomes? We see some children with really heavy and frequent alcohol exposure who do just great, and some children with pretty light exposure, maybe once a week or less, having some serious issues. And we see this for most of the drugs that we study. One would expect things to be dependent on dose, as in a smaller dose gives you a smaller effect. But we don't see that with most drugs that we look at. And the reason for that, I suspect, is because it's not just the drugs, or maybe in some cases it's not the drugs at all. And we're actually studying something that is associated with substance use. It's really important when we're looking at this data to recognize the difference between associations and a cause and effect relationship. One example that's used by academics a lot is, like, if aliens came down to Earth and saw a bunch of people with umbrellas every time it rained, they might come to the conclusion that when people want it to rain, they open umbrellas and the umbrellas cause the rain. When in reality, it's actually the other way around. So it's very, very easy to identify associations, right? Umbrellas and rain go together somehow. It's much more difficult to figure out which causes the other, or if there's even any relationship between the two, or whether it's that in cities where it rains a lot of people have umbrellas. There's so much context that goes into this, and it's really difficult to parse that out in research studies, although we have been getting better and better at it over the last 40 years or so. Next slide. The benzodiazepines don't get a lot of attention, and I suspect that's because they're prescribed. So we just assume that they're fine and everything's safe, because we all know that legality and safety go hand in hand, right? I'm being sarcastic in case it isn't clear. We know that benzodiazepine use is just really, really common in substance using populations, both folks who use uppers like methamphetamine and cocaine, and people who use downers like heroin and other opioid drugs. And the reasons for that are different in different contexts. So for people who use stimulants, a lot of times they will use benzodiazepines to come down after a long run, or to go to sleep each night if they're more moderate daily users. And then in the context of downers, we see people using benzodiazepines to make their supply last longer. So we know that benzodiazepines, and particularly opioids, have a synergistic effect pharmacologically, which means that it's more than just the effect of one plus the effect of the other. It ends up being more like the benzodiazepines don't add to the opioids, they multiply the opioids. So you can use a much smaller opioid dose if you also include a benzodiazepine. And in a lot of contexts, benzodiazepines are much easier to access and possibly cheaper than opioids. So it makes sense for a lot of people to use in that way. Now, the data we have about benzodiazepine exposure during pregnancy mostly comes from studies of pregnant people who were using benzodiazepines as prescribed. So we find very kind of weak data for possible effects and subtle effects. We see that maybe we have higher rates of congenital malformations like cleft lip and cleft palate, where there's a separation of the lip near the philtrum, that wrinkly part between the nose and the lip. And sometimes it goes all the way back to the top of the mouth or the palate, which is a pretty mild and pretty common congenital malformation anyhow, fairly simple to fix in infancy and early babyhood. We also see a possible neonatal withdrawal with prenatal exposure. We're pretty sure that that exists because we have seen when babies are in the NICU and they're sedated for surgery or intubation and ventilation, if they're on like a drip of benzodiazepines or frequent dosing for a long period of time, we do see withdrawal. and most units will have a weaning protocol to go for that. But we really don't have great information on unprescribed benzodiazepine use during pregnancy. It just seems like with all of the, with all of the possibly misplaced interests about other substances and kind of the overreactions about other substances, it just seems really weird to me that people just are not really that focused on benzodiazepines, especially considering the prevalence in this population. Next slide. One other confounding factor about benzodiazepines is that most of the studies that I was able to find about benzodiazepine use in pregnancy was people who were prescribed benzodiazepines for sleep disturbances. And we know from research on the effects of insomnia and other sleep disturbances in pregnancy that some of these same associations are seen. So it's really tough to figure out, do benzodiazepines cause all of this, or some of this, or none of this? Is it more related to sleep disturbances? And so that's kind of the research that I would like to see going forward. Next slide. So my cannabis slide doesn't really have a lot on it because there just really isn't any strong evidence of any severe and lasting negative effect on pregnancies. We have mostly conflicting data. For example, with birth weights, some studies find a slight reduction in weight at birth, some find no difference, and some find that babies of people who use cannabis are actually slightly larger. So when we see results like that, and it's over and over and multiple studies, it leads to me, I begin to think, okay, we're not really looking at cannabis. I'd also like to add that in these studies, it almost ends up as a game of telephone. So like when you read a big professional organization's statement paper about cannabis or something, they'll say something that sounds really alarming, like infants of people who use cannabis may be significantly lower birth weight than other folks. But what they're talking about oftentimes, if you follow back the trail of citations back to the original study, is maybe a difference of 200 grams or a few ounces. So we're looking at most of the babies are within the normal range. In most of the studies that I've looked at, all of the babies are within the normal range, and nobody is under 2,500 grams, or roughly 5 pounds, 9 ounces. So what we're seeing is, a full-term baby exposed to cannabis might average at 3,200 grams, and a full-term baby without cannabis exposure might average at 3,400 grams. It's really, it's irrelevant at that point, because both of those weights are like smack dab in the healthy and normal range. So it's really important to actually read the studies, because what we'll see is the original authors will do the study and they'll find that data, and in their discussion they'll say, babies of people who use cannabis were consistently and significantly smaller than babies of people who didn't use cannabis. And they're using significant in the context of statistical significance, not clinical significance. One of my favorite researchers explains this as, one baby gets a B and the other one gets a B+. So both of those are fine. This is a non-problem. And we find that with lots and lots of research on cannabis in particular. Another thing I'd like to mention is that there are a couple long-term studies of cannabis exposure in North America, two main ones. One is based out of Pittsburgh, studies a primarily city-dwelling, unmarried, and Black and people of color population. The other one is in Ottawa, Canada, studying a primarily middle to upper class and white population. And neither one of these studies finds any real strong effects or evidence, but it's interesting because the study on white middle class people in the context of universal healthcare provided by the government somehow do so much better than babies that are living in really deprived environments. And so this is kind of an example of cannabis not really being we're trying to study cannabis, but we're really just studying socio-demographic predictors of healthcare outcomes. There's a third study that began in the late 80s and early 90s, which got their funding cut by NIDA. And this study was done by a medical anthropologist. So it's really interesting because there's just a lot of rich contextual data that was collected in addition to the typical, like measurements of weight and the more dry stuff. And the other thing that's interesting about this study is that it was done in Jamaica. And in Jamaica, the context of cannabis use is very different from that in the United States. Whereas in the United States, especially in the 80s and 90s, cannabis use, if you got caught, was associated more with lower socioeconomic status and, more socio-demographic predictors of poor health outcomes. Whereas in Jamaica, cannabis use was associated with affluence, and children who were exposed in utero and by breast and chest feeding to cannabis were from much more affluent families that had a lot of adults in the home, a lot of different caregivers. So they'd be taken care of by both the parents as well as aunties and grandparents and cousins. And so there was kind of a richer home environment as well. And what this study found was that consistently children exposed to cannabis outperformed children not exposed to cannabis. Now, I am by no means suggesting that this means that cannabis is protective or helpful or that we should advocate for people to use it during pregnancy. But what I am saying is that this study was looking at sociodemographic factors and trying to see if cannabis was related, but it doesn't appear to me that it was. And again, both the children who were exposed and were not exposed, they were all doing fine and well within the normal range for expectations. Next slide. And I don't really think I need to answer this question, why are the results of studies aligned along socioeconomic lines? I think we just kind of covered that because it appears that, as one researcher put it, Dr. Freed, who did the Ottawa study that I talked about before, OPPS, Ottawa Prospective Prenatal Study, I think is what that stands for. He said, effects of cannabis, I'm paraphrasing, but pretty tightly, I think I remember how he said it. Effects of cannabis, if any, are extremely subtle. And so this is after studying this for 20 plus years. He comes to this conclusion that if there are any effects, which he's not sure about, they're subtle. And so I think we should definitely keep doing this research, but let's start to look in other areas, because we've been looking for, growth delay, developmental delay, intellectual deficits. We've been looking for that stuff for close to 40 years and we're not finding it. So maybe we can start looking at other aspects of cannabis exposure. Next slide. So for opioids, the biggest thing that we see that's pretty consistent is neonatal opioid withdrawal, or NOW. And I use that phrase because I don't really like NAS, or neonatal abstinence syndrome, because it's imprecise. And I've seen clinicians who maybe are less informed treat all substance exposure as NAS, which is based on opioid exposure only. For example, using the Finnegan scoring tool on infants that were exposed to cocaine, for example, which the Finnegan scoring tool, I have a lot of problems with it, but it has only been validated for opioid use. I also one time saw an infant admitted to the NICU because of substance exposure to cocaine. Both mom and baby only tested positive for cocaine. She said she only used cocaine, and yet we put this infant on a morphine regimen that lasted for like 3.5 weeks. So we took a baby that had no tolerance or dependence or exposure to opioids and gave it to that infant. So we developed the dependence and then we weaned off of it, which was just really unhelpful. So I think it's important to use this precise language, and especially in our policies, because that's the kind of thing that perhaps could have helped that clinician to take a pause and say, oh, this is just for opioids, not for everything else. We see that Withdrawal signs in infants are not dose dependent, which is so interesting to me, because we know that for adults, when we give opioids to adults, we know that the results are pretty predictable and dose dependent. A higher dose by weight will result in X, Y, and Z. But we don't really see that for infants. And I think, again, that comes back to the whole context. Each pregnant person is different. Each pregnancy for an individual is different. And there are all kinds of changes in metabolism related to age and weight and, other environmental contaminant exposures. And so I think that I would love to see more research into context around substance use and how that relates to signs of opioid withdrawal for infants. Another thing that I just want to throw out there and make sure we're all on the same page about is that long-term outcomes for these babies are similar to their peer group. A lot of people say that these babies are grow up stunted, or they're going to have all these problems, or they're at risk for X, Y, and Z. But that is not because of their opioid use. We have really, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, both agree long-term outcomes are not really affected by opioid exposure. So I would love to see that myth going away. Next slide. So again, what I want to know is, why are the effects so wide? We have estimates of infants exposed to substances who require pharmacological treatment for opioid withdrawal. They just vary so widely. It's like 5% to 95%, depending on which population you're looking at. And I think that a lot of these numbers, they're the best that we have right now, but they're super flawed, because in my 17 years of experience watching these babies, what I see is that, and I've also worked at 14 hospitals in 7 states, what I see is that in hospitals that provide, privacy for the parent, somewhere to sleep, somewhere to eat, somewhere to shower, who really partner with parents to provide those non-pharmacological treatments that we know work so well, such as skin-to-skin care, breast and chest feeding, and just holding by the parents and bonding. Those babies do so much better and have such a decreased pharmacological requirement. Whereas in other units I've worked where an infant that is suspected or confirmed to have been exposed to opioids is immediately taken from the family after the cord is cut and taken to the NICU, which is kind of the opposite non-pharmacological environment as what is ideal. So, you're away from your parents, you're in a strange place with strange smells, bright lights, a bunch of different people going back and forth, lots of noise. If we wanted to design the absolute worst environment to place a baby at risk of having withdrawal signs, the NICU would be it. It's perfect. It has all of the things that we don't want. And so when we're looking at these estimates, it's really important not just to focus on the nature versus nurture. You can't just focus on the nature part. What happens after birth is vitally important to lengths of stay, pharmacological treatment requirement, and cumulative morphine or other treatment medication dose. Next slide. So for stimulants, I want to specify there are so many stimulants out there. I mainly study cocaine, methamphetamine, and caffeine because those are the most commonly used ones. And they also kind of all have a similar outcome. They each work on a different receptors in the brain and through a different pathway, but the result of each one of these substances and medications is, increased heart rate and blood pressure and respiratory rate, vasoconstriction or narrowing of the blood vessels, and so the effects that we see seem to all be related to those kinds of metabolic physical changes. There's a lot of misinformation out there, particularly about stimulants. The only thing that the literature consistently shows for all 3 of these stimulants is the possibility of an association with lower birth weights and shorter gestation. So that could translate to more preterm birth. But again, we're seeing stuff like a difference between, 38 weeks and 2 days and like 39 weeks and 5 days. So it's most of these kids are still within the normal range or similar to the general population when controlled for those sociodemographic factors that we talked about before, such as, poverty, nutrition, exposure to violence, exposure to racism, and some of these other things that we know can have detrimental effects on pregnancy outcomes. There is, most people cite an association that's strong enough to be assumed to be a cause and effect relationship for cocaine with abruption of the placenta, which for those that might not know, that's when the placenta, which is basically the organ that feeds the baby and takes out the waste products, when it detaches from the wall of the uterus before the baby's born. Usually it happens within, minutes after the baby's born and all those blood vessels close up and everything's fine. But if it happens when the uterus is all stretched out and unable to clamp down and close those blood vessels, what we get is the pregnant person bleeding out and the baby bleeding out simultaneously. So it can be quite a serious and emergency situation. Now, most of the studies that found that correlation were done in the 80s and 90s in the height of the crack baby epidemic. Ira Chasnoff, as Natalie mentioned earlier, was involved in a lot of them. And they did just a really bad job of even attempting to control for sociodemographic factors. So what we end up with is a group of folks who are, accessing prenatal care from really early on, like before 8 weeks. We see this group as typically housed, married, privately insured, all of these predictors of good health outcomes, compared with another group who is oftentimes unstably housed, exposed to violence in their day-to-day life, either intimate partner violence or neighborhood violence. We see exposure to racism and other systemic oppressions. And then we're comparing these two as if cocaine is the only difference between the two groups. And so we're getting a lot of results that really need some unpacking and can't just be taken at face value. However, that is kind of like the research base that we have to build on, because that's the first kind of series of studies that were done. And so a lot of times they're, like I said, that game of telephone with the citation. Somebody will cite that in their lit review for their study, and then that will get cited in a systematic review or meta-analysis, and then a few more of those will happen, and then finally it'll end up in a position paper or something like that. And what we end up seeing is just a grossly exaggerated statement of the risk. So I should speed it up here, sorry. Next slide. So with stimulants in particular, I just wonder how long are we going to keep repeating the mistakes of the crack baby era? Because we are. Every 5 to 7 years, there's a new one. Sometimes it's cannabis, sometimes it's opioids. They come up with these horrible, cute little names too every time, like oxytox, you may have heard. Sometimes it's methamphetamine, but always there's this pattern of taking research data, and from the beginning, the very researchers who collected the data will interpret it in the most dire and scary and attention-grabbing kind of way. And we just keep doing this. By the time it makes it to the regular media or to a character in a movie or a TV show, it's just so grossly exaggerated that that it doesn't even make sense anymore based on the original data. But that's what we see. And I want to stress that as clinicians, we see that too. And it's not like we can wire our brain to remember stuff that we, read in a journal and not something that we saw on, NCIS or something like that. Because our brain is going to remember all that stuff, and it's all jumbled up in there, and that's how our beautiful and terrifying brains work. So it's really, really important to consciously question all that and think about, why do I think what I think? Do I know this, or did I hear this? Especially when it comes to, hot topics like substance use and pregnancy. Next slide. So for Tobacco and nicotine, most of our studies, it should be noted, are on cigarette smoking specifically. And especially these days, people are consuming tobacco and nicotine in such a wide variety of ways. We really don't have any good data about vaping during pregnancy, for example. We do have pretty decent data about vaping and non-combustible forms of tobacco and nicotine consumption for the general population who isn't pregnant, and everybody agrees, the United States, the UK, Europe, that using non-combustible forms such as vaping, patches, gum, and stuff like that it vastly reduces the risk of harm. So I just wanted to throw that out there. With all of our data on cigarette smoking, we have tons and tons of it, like an avalanche of data. So we know that there are all these risks that are increased. Most of them are really modestly increased. Like you go from having a 0.1 chance to a 0.3 chance. So it is a tripling of the risk, but when it is so small to begin with, it's certainly something to keep an eye on, but it's not something to, have a freak out about. Next slide. So, do we have the other tobacco slide? I can't see it yet. Is it there, Natalie?
Sorry, Joelle, I'm not sure that we did.
Did I not send it to you? I'm sorry. Okay, I'll just talk about it anyway. You can stay on this slide. So the next slide, oh, there it is, perfect. So with tobacco and nicotine, I like to use this as an example. I am far from suggesting that we should stigmatize tobacco and nicotine. I want to suggest that we respond to all substance use the way we respond to tobacco and nicotine. If we responded in the way that we do for cannabis or opioids, our criminal justice system and our child welfare systems would be immediately incapacitated and overrun with volume, because it's just such a large proportion of folks that use tobacco and nicotine during pregnancy. And we know that. And we know that it is much safer and better for both children, families, and pregnant people to keep these families together and to not deprive them of human milk either. Every professional organization agrees that it is safer to recommend breast and chest feeding and provision of human milk for families where the birthing parent is a tobacco user, a smoker, rather than continuing to smoke and feeding formula. And it's really interesting to me that the medical community is able to grasp in this situation that we're not choosing between perfection, which would be, not smoking and breastfeeding. That's one option, or smoking and breastfeeding. That's not the options that are faced by our patient. Our patient is deciding whether to smoke and breastfeed or smoke and formula feed. So that's what we're looking at here. Obviously, we counsel everybody at every visit about the availability of smoking cessation help, but we accept that the majority of folks are going to continue smoking, and we keep helping them, and we keep helping them reduce their risks anyway. So I would love to see this applied to all other substance use, because so often, like with cannabis and with opioids and with stimulants, we see policy being made as if the choices provided to folks are perfection or drug use, where we need to have a range of options and to celebrate any step closer to perfection. Obviously, I'm a perfectionist myself. We all want to get to perfect, but we need to accept that there are a lot of steps along the way and that each step is worthy of being celebrated and valued. And I think it goes back to Natalie now.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much for that, Joelle. That was really, really fascinating, and you just blew my mind. But I will get moving. And now that we've gone over the myths and facts and where exactly dangerous myths about substance use and pregnancy come into play, we know that dangerous myths can turn into dangerous policy, and this law in Wisconsin is just one example of that. So I'll go into Wisconsin's Action 92. Action 92, also known as the Unborn Child Protection Act, was put into place in Wisconsin in 1998. This law allows for the detention and prosecution of pregnant people on the basis of suspected, past or current drug or alcohol use. This law is also referred to as the Cocaine Mom Law or the Cocaine Mom Statute, which you kind of see in some media portrayals sometimes. This law was passed decades after the war on drugs was started, and it was passed after the crack baby myth again had been thoroughly debunked as junk science by experts in the field. Written in the legislation itself, this law was passed because, quote, unborn children have certain basic needs and therefore need to be free from physical harm due to the habitual lack of self-control of their expectant mothers. The pregnant person may be forced into unnecessary drug treatment, psychiatric hospitals, or even jail as a result of enforcement. The pregnant person is also not guaranteed a lawyer during very early important stages of the proceeding. However, the fetus is assigned and guaranteed a lawyer. And additionally, the act does not require that the pregnant person should even receive or have access to prenatal care during their time in custody. And on at least one instance, a pregnant woman was denied her request for prenatal care. Act 92 was ruled unconstitutional in 2017 by a judge in Wisconsin because the law was ruled to be unconstitutionally vague and in violation of the constitutional right to due process. But the law was kept in place due to the efforts of Wisconsin's former governor Scott Walker and his attorney general, meaning that the law is still enforceable. But enforcement varies by county. The enforcement of the law and the result of enforcement is really up to the county prosecutor on how they'd like to handle these cases. Since Act 92's enactment, thousands of pregnant people in Wisconsin have been investigated for allegations of unborn child abuse. But we don't know what exactly happens after someone is referred to the state for allegations of, quote, unborn child abuse, because the proceedings are cloaked in secrecy and are behind closed doors in juvenile court. It's believed by experts that Act 92 is a dangerous failure. Here's why. Act 92 can act as a way to strip people of their bodily autonomy and parental rights based on suspicions of drug or alcohol use. This law also acts as an obstacle in receiving drug treatment or even prenatal care because laws like Act 92 aim to shame people, particularly pregnant people or people with capacity for pregnancy that use or have used drugs or alcohol in the past. People that use drugs already face stigma and barriers in seeking health care or drug treatment, as we discussed before. Laws like Act 92 also make pregnant people not want to go to the doctor for drug treatment or even prenatal care in fear of being referred to the state. People are scared to seek help because they don't want to lose their parental rights or be referred to the state for unborn child abuse. And major medical associations and organizations also agree that the coercive nature of Act 92 negatively affects mothers and babies. In a brief filed in support of national advocates for pregnant women's litigation by over a dozen leading medical and human rights organizations, they stated that medical science does not support Act 92's coercive approach and that the act hurts mothers and babies, that the law violates human rights, and that the law is a dangerous failure. Major medical associations believe that voluntary confidential healthcare is the most effective way to promote healthy mothers and babies. This law serves as a way to use folk concerns about substance use and pregnancy as a pretext to target poor people, people of color, and pregnant people generally, and strip them of their human rights. It also takes away every single right associated with being a full person under the Constitution, and again, strips away full bodily autonomy, decision-making abilities, individual liberty, and the right to privacy simply on the basis of being pregnant. No pregnant person should fear having their decision-making abilities and bodily autonomy taken away because they are pregnant. And again, punitive laws like Wisconsin's Act 92 can force people to avoid receiving health care due to fear of being referred to the state or losing their parental rights or even jail time. And mandated reporting is also something that we have goes on in Wisconsin. And I mean across the United States. But mandated reporting is a set of state or federal laws that require a certain people to report specific harms to the police or child protective services. Who is mandated to report and what harms to be reported changed by state. And for example, mandated reporters in Wisconsin can be social service workers, law enforcement personnel, medical personnel like doctors, nurses, midwives, or mental health professionals. And mandated reporters are required by law to report cases of child abuse, including unborn child abuse, and could face repercussions if they do not report. But they may not know the harm that this law can actually cause when someone is accused of this type of abuse. We know that in at least Wisconsin, social service workers report cases of unborn child abuse at higher rates than other types of reporters. And we know that Wisconsin's law is specific to Wisconsin, and no other states have laws like Act 92. Drug testing newborns also varies by hospital and state. However, drug testing newborns, we know that Black babies are far more likely to be drug tested for more than white babies. And newborns can be tested without consent. In at least one study, it was found that Black moms and their newborns were 1.5 times more likely to be tested for illicit drugs as non-Black women. This study also notes that the race was not independently associated with a positive result. And in this sort of medical racism, this is a way to target Black mothers, people of color, and low-income people for drug testing, and that leads to mandated reporting in the state. And this is why Reproaction and NAPW teamed up to create the hashtag Wisconsin Fights 292 campaign. This campaign aims to educate on and ultimately eliminate Act 292. The Wisconsin Fights 292 campaign aims to educate Wisconsinites on the dangers of this law, because the amount of people that I've talked to in Wisconsin that aren't aware of this law is pretty scary. And most people, even people that work in repro rights and health spaces, don't know that this law is still in place and that it's still being enforced. And most people don't know what can happen after someone is investigated under this law. We also want to educate those who may be most at risk for enforcement, like low-income people, people of color, people who use drugs, and unhoused people. And again, people may not seek health care or may not be honest with their doctors because of laws like these. We also aim to educate mandated reporters on the dangers of this law because, again, they may not know what exactly happens after they report a case of unborn child abuse. We also want to educate as a matter of public health. Again, leading medical and human rights organizations state this law is destructive, it harms parents, mothers, and babies, that medical science does not support the coercive approach that Act 292 takes and strips people of their bodily autonomy. We also aim to change the culture around drug use and pregnancy by fighting stigma and creating a new narrative from a harm reductionist standpoint. Because I think, as Joelle said this before, a lot of the language that we use to describe drug use and pregnancy is highly stigmatizing and is clouded in myths and stereotypes stemming from racist depictions of Black motherhood. We're also urging policymakers and legislators to take action to stop relying on stereotypes about drug use and pregnancy and focus on things like access to prenatal care, drug treatment, and community resources, not punishment. We did this with direct action and fighting back. And prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, we took action by doing informational pickets and distributing informational flyers at places like, hospitals, drug treatment centers, emergency rooms, free and low-cost prenatal care, healthcare clinics. Well, basically anywhere that we think people who are at risk for enforcement may be or may seek help. These flyers contain information on what the laws were and gave real-life examples. And to the right of the screen, it says, "Are you pregnant? Your rights and your health are at stake." This is the flyer that we handed out. The first image is the front page, and the back image is the back page. And I did this at dozens of places across Wisconsin. So I won't be talking about Tammy's story too much because we are actually able to offer free personhood policing pregnant women in America screenings for all United States residents. The link for that will be dropped in the chat box. But Tammy was a pregnant woman living in northern Wisconsin when she was investigated for allegations of unborn child abuse. A lot of things happened to Tammy that will be outlined in the documentary. You can go watch that now for free. Again, the link is in the comments, I believe. It's available. It started to be available on June 14th, and it was available until July 14th. And tickets are free but limited, and I can tell you for a fact that they are filling up really quick. So you may want to get your tickets sooner rather than later. It's a fantastic documentary. We've done, tons of screenings like this, and it always is a hit. So please feel free to check that out. So now I'll go into criminalizing pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes. Laws like Act 292 are essentially an extension of what we know as fetal personhood or fetal protection laws. Laws like these, aka fetal personhood laws, aim to define fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses as legal persons, essentially trying to establish fetuses as completely separate from the pregnant person, often resulting in the criminalization of pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes. We know that there is no way to give rights to a fetus without subtracting the pregnant person, and yet there are laws like these all over the country. But Wisconsin is unique as the proceedings are held in secret and the juvenile court allows for the court to take physical custody of a pregnant person and lock them up. However, as of 2017, 18 states consider substance use during pregnancy a form of child abuse under civil child welfare laws, And as of 2017, 38 states had, quote, fetal assault laws on the books, which consider fetuses as potential victims of a crime. And 4 states consider drug use during pregnancy to be grounds for civil commitment or involuntary detention in a treatment facility. It's important to note that fetal personhood measures, specifically Wisconsin's Act 92, had the support of anti-abortion activists and lawmakers at the time of its passing. These sort of laws still have support from anti-abortion groups today, despite recommendations and guidance from major health organizations and reproductive rights and justice activists and advocates. The original purpose, or the alleged purpose, of some of these fetal personhood measures was to allegedly protect pregnant people from violence, but we see that these laws are used to criminalize pregnant women, pregnant people, and their actions during their pregnancies. This all fits into a larger category of criminalization of pregnancy outcomes being racist. We know that criminalization is racist. The anti-abortion movement, again, is rooted in white supremacy and the exploitation of Black women and their bodies, and we know this. The influx of immigrants at the end of slavery scared white people and in the United States and prompted abortion restrictions and criminalization. And it's no surprise that marginalized groups, including low-income people, people who use drugs, and people of color, are disproportionately affected by criminalizing pregnancy outcomes and pregnancy and often bear the brunt of these types of policies. To that point, abortion restrictions are inherently racist. Time-sensitive abortion bans, barriers to care like waiting periods, multiple unnecessary appointments, travel and costs, etc., are just obstacles that marginalized populations have to jump over. I'll just go into a quick example of Wisconsin. Wisconsin has bad abortion laws. Wisconsin has a 24-hour waiting period and mandatory abortion counseling, Only 3 abortion providers are in the state. 2 are Planned Parenthood and 1 is an NB provider. There is also an required unnecessary ultrasound and a 20-week abortion bans. All of these policies, as an example, act as a physical and financial barrier to care, often resulting in miles of travel, multiple days taken off work for unnecessary multiple procedures, and so on. The list goes on, and people facing these types of problems are often already marginalized. Another thing to consider is the criminalization of abortions and abortion bans. As stated on Reproaction's hashtag, Stop Prosecuting Abortion campaign page, the logical consequence of abortion bans and criminalization is sending people to jail. And though pro-life leaders say that they only want abortion providers to be punished, what about people who self-manage? Some women are already being sent to jail for self-managing their abortions. And as said recently by a prominent pro-life leader, quote, pro-life should be ours, abolition is pro-life, criminalization is pro-life. This is truly pro-life, end quote. This quote in particular is troublesome as they're saying the quiet part out loud. They want to criminalize people who have abortions, period. In sum, the criminalization of pregnancy is directly linked to the criminalization of abortions and can lead to the criminalization of any action taken by a pregnant person during pregnancy.
If I may, can I just jump in really quick, Natalie?
Absolutely.
So I wanted to bring up that a few moments ago you were talking about how these personhood laws are supported by the anti-choice movement. And I think it's really important to note that these laws specifically encourage abortions. There's at least one case in North America of an Indigenous person. I forget what her first name was. Last name was Grey Wind. That's Grey Wind, who was being prosecuted for using substances while pregnant and obtained an abortion for the explicit purpose of ending that prosecution. So I'm not advocate. I'm absolutely the opposite of an anti-choice person. But what I'm saying is these laws are counterproductive to their own goals, and we should, of course, not be coercing pregnant people in either direction, either towards or away from abortion. And that is what these laws do. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Joelle. Okay. Oh, geez, I don't like this noise. Okay, so I won't go into this too much, but this is a really, really great recent example of policing pregnant people's choices and their bodies. The text read, Alabama mom faces felony for filling doctor's prescription while pregnant. You can read more about that on NAPW's website, and I'm sure if you Google this, it will pop up right away. This is just another example of how policing pregnant people's choices and bodies leads to criminalization. Okay, and that is basically it. We have about 10 minutes left for Q&A. Here are some additional resources. One is the Pregnancy and Substance Use Harm Reduction Toolkit, made or created by the National Harm Reduction Coalition and the Academy of Perinatal Harm Reduction. Then I used this next source extensively, Criminalizing Pregnancy from Amnesty International, and again, there's National Advocates for Pregnant Women. But we will go over to the Q&A really quickly. Give me 1 second. So Joelle, I think this may be a question for you, and I'll just read it off. Are there no long-term studies on the mental effects of cannabis, which might not appear within decades later? Does that make sense?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Yeah, so there are studies. They just don't find those effects that they're looking for. The studies that I mentioned from Pittsburgh and Ottawa, Canada, the Canada one, I believe, is the one that goes back to the 70s. So the people who were babies in that study are now in their 40s. So, like, sure, it might take 60 years to see these effects, but we've been watching these children and these people grow for literally their entire lives, and we haven't really seen that. It's important also when we're looking at these kinds of studies to look at what are the rates of these things in everyday life, because that's something that's so frequently left out of the discussion on these research numbers. Like, say for example, you find a miscarriage rate in your population who's using substances of like 1 to 3%. And that sounds really scary until you realize that that is the same as in the general population or in the local community that your study population lives in. So I know that we've all been told this, and it takes a lot of mental rearranging, but no, we just don't have that information related to prenatal cannabis exposure. There are some studies about cannabis exposure in childhood and youth that find slightly different results. We know that fetal exposure is mediated by the placenta. So that means that the fetal, THC level in the blood tends to be quite significantly less than the pregnant person. We also know that despite concentration of cannabinoids in human milk, because they are lipophilic or fat-loving, so the human milk concentration of THC will be higher than the concentration in the pregnant or the postpartum person's blood, but absorption in the stomach is very low for most drugs, and particularly for lipophilic drugs like cannabis in infants. So even though they are being, it's kind of a weird comparison, right? It's like, oh, well, they're getting more than they would be if they were drinking the parent's blood, but nobody ever drinks the parent's blood. So I don't understand why it's significant that we compare the levels in milk to levels in blood. What we really need to compare is the levels in the parent's blood to the levels in the infant's blood after consuming the milk. And we find that rates are just very, very low for that. About 1/100th of the parent's dose makes it into the baby. And most of what gets into the baby is it passes through unchanged and unabsorbed. So I know that we've all been told this for years and decades, but I'm here to say it's not true. And I'd love to have a more longer back and forth, more nuanced conversation about this and provide you with, I've been keeping an annotated bibliography of my research for about 10 years. And so I'd be more than happy to share how I came to these conclusions for folks that have a spare 10 or 20 hours to read through all the research. Good question.
That was awesome, Joelle. Thank you so much for that. Okay, great. So I'm going to go into our next question because it seems like we only have a few minutes left, and I'll try to answer this to the best of my ability. And the question is, do you think that the most modern mainstream pro-choice policy actually reinforces policies like Act 92, by most often recodifying the state's interest in potential fetal life? And that is a loaded question, I feel like. It's a very layered question, so I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability. So the first part, do you think that the modern mainstream pro-choice policy actually enforces policies like Act 92? I think that we have a big focus on, or that is a collective. Since the initiation of the fetal rights movement, we've switched from thinking about fetal rights separately from the pregnant person, right? We think about fetuses having separate rights from pregnant people. And I think that that is pretty pervasive in our society. I think that in a lot of legislation that even is popping up now, that a lot of legislation does, recodify the state's interest in potential fetal life. And I think that the modern pro-choice movement and a lot of people that align themselves with pro-choice ideology, I think that pro-choice is a little bit of a, I don't think pro-choice is I don't think it covers what it needs to cover for this topic specifically, because I think that this conversation about Act 92 and criminalizing substance use during pregnancy is a little more in depth than what the pro-choice bubble can provide. I think that the pro-life movement has done unfortunately, really great job of getting our minds to focus on fetal rights instead of the rights of the pregnant person actually carrying the fetus. So I hope that answers the question. And I think we only have a few more minutes left. So I think those are all the questions. Okay. And then maybe a simpler version of my question. Don't quote progressive state laws and policies that reinforce the viability standard, give cover, and even legitimacy to laws like 292 by continuing to codify the state's interest in potential fetal life. Again, a loaded question, a really great question, and I wish that I could answer it better because it's so great. And I think that, again, like kind of what Joelle said, I think this is kind of more of a deeper discussion than we can have in the next, few minutes. But again, I'll just read that one more time. Don't quote progressive state laws and policies that reinforce the viability standard, give cover, and even legitimacy to laws like 292 by continuing to codify the state's interest in potential fetal life. I think that that's definitely correct. I think that the state, maybe depending by state, is it's different depending by state, right? Different states and different fetal person laws. So I think that especially in Wisconsin, this law, gives legitimacy to the state's interest in potential fetal life, in that it literally is putting fetal life, quote unquote, fetal life before pregnant people. And I think that this is a, underlying theme in that we see care in Wisconsin, especially under this law. I hope that does answer the question. I'm not sure, but yeah, I hope that answered the question. Are there any thoughts that you would like to finish up with, Joelle, before we move on to more ways to take action?
Yeah, I just want to briefly talk a little bit about let's together kind of consciously bring all this together and see the ways in which they interact. We didn't really talk much about it, but a lot of times laws that are specifically designed to, let's talk about I think this one is in Tennessee. You can correct me, Natalie, because you are definitely the law person on this panel. But there are lots of laws that are designed to protect children from substances in the home or, substance production such as meth labs and things like that. And a lot of these laws have that intent. However, they're being twisted in a bunch of different ways. So we see people being prosecuted under these laws for being pregnant and having a substance use disorder, which is certainly not why the law was passed. And then we also see these laws being used to prosecute people who self-manage abortion or maybe obtain abortion medications from, not their doctor in some manner. And so we sometimes see ourselves as abortion rights advocates and harm reductionists as in two separate silos. But the people who hate us both equally, and they hate us in the same ways, and they use the same methods to go after us. So for that reason, we need to recognize our intersections and our connectedness and band together to push back against the people who are coming after us.
That was great, Joelle. Thank you so much. I literally have nothing to add because that was so great. So I will just move on to additional ways to take action quickly, unless Joelle has something else she'd like to, or they'd like to say. Oh,
No,
okay.
please go ahead.
Great. Okay, so here are some additional ways to take action. So you can sign our petition affirming the rights and liberties of all pregnant Wisconsinites by going to reproaction.org/campaign/WI Fights 292. And again, you can watch Personhood Policing Pregnant Women in America using this little link right here. I think it was also dropped in the chat box. And then here are ways to keep in touch. So across socials, Reproaction is at Reproaction, and there is our website link. And the Academy of Perinatal Harm Reduction has a public Facebook group, the Academy of Perinatal Harm Reduction, and then their website is right there. And it looks like I literally have 30 seconds to round this out. So in all, thank you all so much for your great questions, for your time and attention, and for your work. Thank you, Joelle, for your awesome expertise and your just fantastic, you know, person skills, life skills, etc. I just admire you so much.
Thank you. Back at you, Natalie.
Okay, great. So I think I'm going to end this here because we have nothing else to go over. So thank you all so much for your attention and questions, and we will talk to you next time. Bye.